Moderating this panel is Isabelle Lasserre from the Figaro. Isabelle, over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yes,
very
and if
much.
you can please grab a seat and quiet down so we can hear the panel, please.
I think
Thank you.
Isabelle.
And Isabelle.
Yeah.
Okay, hello
I guess
to
so.
everybody. So we'll have on this panel.
Can you speak louder? Yeah,
Louder?
Yeah, I don't hear you.
Even with this micro?
No.
Is that all right for you? If I speak like that?
Right.
It's your thing which doesn't work, okay? So that's, you know, what happens with the new members of NATO. It's always the same thing. So you don't know yet how it works. I'm joking. So we'll have Benedetta Berti, Director of the Policy Planning at the Office of the General Secretary, Jan Bond from the Center for European Reform, and Jonas Hafström, ex-Swedish ambassador to the US, and Radoslaw Fogiel, member of the Polish Parliament. I'll start directly with you, Benedetta, with a short question. Is NATO stronger or less strong than before since Washington?
Okay, thank you for the question. I think that the short answer, let's start with the short answer. NATO is today stronger and more united than it has been at any point since the end of the Cold War. Now let me maybe give you some evidence of that. First of all, membership. We are now an alliance of 32 countries strong, with Finland and Sweden having completed their accession. This is something that enhances collective security. It makes NATO stronger. It makes Finland and Sweden safer. It's, of course, something to look at as a great sign of progress. So first of all, I think it's important to start with that. And Washington Summit was the first summit where we actually sat at 32 with Finland and Sweden at the table as fully fledged allies. There's also been, and I think this is very, very important, a historic reset of our deterrence and defense posture that started in 2014 following Russia's illegal and illegitimate annexation of Crimea, but really accelerated after 2022. I know you don't want speeches, so I'd be very brief, but when we met in Washington just a few months ago, we were able to take stock of what we have done, and we've went from a place in which only three countries spend 2% of their GDP on defense. Now we're 23 spending 2% or more, with all allies with clear plans to get there. And of course, this is not to be complacent in this security environment marked by Russian aggressive imperialism, by a assertive People's Republic of China, by this growing strategic alignment between the PRC, Russia, Iran, and the DPRK. 2% is the bare minimum, and we need to do more. But we have added over 600 billion in defense spending since 2014. We have now reset our deterrence and defense posture. Much more to be done, but in 2 minutes
but only 9 members are making the 2%. So it's not a lot.
I didn't say there is no work to be done. We should close down and go on holiday. I say we are in a much better trajectory compared to 10 years ago on defense spending, on defense industrial capacity, on rebuilding our posture. We now have 8 multinational battle groups deployed on our eastern flank with 4 defenses. We have, for the first time since the Cold War, regional defense plans that assign forces to territory. We are today capable of defending Europe in a way that we simply weren't before 2014. So we are much stronger. But of course, and this is very important, I think, for me to underline, Washington was a time to celebrate the progress, but was not a time for complacency. There's so much more that needs to be done, including, and I'll stop here, to continue and accelerate what we do to support Ukraine, because if we want to think about a future of Europe that is secure and prosperous, that starts with a sovereign, independent, and democratic Ukraine.
Yeah. Jonas, how do you feel now that you're in NATO? Better? I mean, how does it like? How is life? More secure?
You know, after 200 years of military alignment, Sweden are now come back to their friends. This has been a big, big decision in Sweden. We have a 90% of the votes in the parliament in favor of NATO, 100% of support for Ukraine. And of course, when Finland and Sweden together with Denmark and Norway and Iceland, it will be a much stronger and tougher NATO in the northern part of Europe.
That's it.
Yeah, that's it.
Okay. So,
what else can I say?
Radoslaw, I have an important question for you. For me, there are two solutions if you talk about Ukraine and NATO. It is or NATO in Ukraine or Ukraine in NATO. Okay, what of the two solutions would you prefer and what is feasible or not?
From my Polish perspective as a country neighboring to Russia, we always think that NATO should be doing more, that the changes should happen faster, we should go higher and further. Same with spending. My country is spending already over 4% of GDP on defense. We will encourage our partners to do the same, because we have to face the reality. We are in a new Cold War period, and we have to undust the playbooks from that time. But answering your question, well, for me, Ukraine in NATO is something that will inevitably happen in the future. The only question is when and how. And I think it's up to NATO to figure out a procedure, to figure out a way forward for Ukraine. When my country, when Baltic countries, when Czech Republic and the whole group was joining NATO, we have membership action plans. But this was a solution just for this time, because it's not a requirement. It's not something that we had before. We can come up with a similar solution for Ukraine to make sure their transatlantic future is secured, because otherwise, without Ukraine joining the most successful security project in centuries, we will have war in our part of the world all over again. The other part of your question, NATO in Ukraine, I'm pretty sure there are people in the region who would welcome this, but we have to face the political and military reality. Maybe there was a point in the very beginning of the war to place some sort of peacekeeping forces in Ukraine, non-combatant, non-offensive, just to use their presence to stop Russians from further advancing. Unfortunately, I think we're way past this moment.
Another important question for you, Jan. What future do you see for NATO without Ukraine? And what future would you see for Ukraine without NATO? Of course, you're all three invited to answer to this big question.
So I think that's an interesting question. Maybe I'll start with the second part of it, with what future for Ukraine without NATO. And I think the answer to that is I see a future in which Putin or a Putin-like leader of Russia will continue to see Ukraine as fair game, as a continuing target. Because what we are implicitly saying is we accept Putin's sphere of influence logic, and we accept that Ukraine is not part of our sphere of influence. I don't think we should accept either of those propositions. The mistake that we made was in 2008. It was to say that Ukraine and Georgia will join NATO, and then to do nothing to move Ukraine and Georgia into NATO. We wasted years. Putin did not waste those years. So I think the prospects for Ukraine's security outside NATO are quite poor in the long term. It would continue to be subject to a very considerable threat. What's the future for NATO without Ukraine? I think that depends on what happens in Ukraine to a large extent. If Ukraine is either defeated outright, which I think is unlikely, but I wouldn't completely exclude a collapse at some point. But I think that's my least likely scenario. Or if Ukraine is forced into a peace deal on very unfavorable terms, which I think is more possible, especially if it does not continue to receive practical aid from the West, military aid from the West, then I think the risk to other parts of NATO becomes much higher. I think that the Baltic states in particular are quite exposed. They have quite limited strategic depth between the Russian border and the Baltic Sea. They are not very easy to reinforce. Even after the increase in NATO forces in the east, which Benedetta referred to, certainly in Estonia and Latvia, we're only looking at 1,000 or a bit more than 1,000 NATO troops in each of those. Yep. That's not enough to mount an effective defense. And so I think if NATO does not take in Ukraine and ensure that Ukraine is well defended, then the prospects for other parts of NATO, the threat to other parts of NATO becomes more serious.
Do you agree, Jonas? Do you want to add something to this?
I agree totally what you're saying. I mean, NATO and Ukraine is our rimland. And if Putin managed to what he wants, to cover the whole Ukraine, the next time will be the Baltic states, the next time will be Finland, the next time will be Sweden. So for us, it's a vital question to really get rid of Putin and get them out of Ukraine.
So now, one of the biggest problem for NATO, or of NATO, Donald Trump. What if he is re-elected in November? What's the plans, Benedetta?
Yeah, so just very gently, but I would say NATO's biggest problem is Russia.
I said one of the biggest problems.
Well, let me make a list of what I think the biggest problems for NATO are. We might have a slightly different view on the topic. I would say that for NATO, our biggest threats are certainly Russia's aggressive behavior,
Sure.
The war in Ukraine with its, as was very eloquently explained, its extreme potential to change the security architecture in Europe for the wars for the long term, an increasingly more assertive People's Republic of China that today is the key enabler of Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine, a growing strategic alignment between adversarial actors like the PRC, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. And I could go on talking about terrorism, instability, climate change, but I will not. All of this to say, let's be clear about what our threats are. In terms of will there be political changes and do we think about how to deal with this? Of course. If I have to, I am very confident that, and looking at polling, looking at the US Congress, that there is a strong bipartisan support for NATO in the American public, in Congress. I also believe that the relationship between North America and Europe and NATO will remain strong based on strategic interest. It remains in a key strategic interest of the United States to have a strong NATO as the mechanism through which to organize the defense of Europe. Are there criticisms that when President Trump was in office, he made to NATO allies that we have worked on over the last few years? Certainly. A lot of it was about defense spending and the fact that Europeans weren't doing enough. And that was true then, and it's probably still true now, although we're in a much better place and there is a lot of work to do. So I think we need to continue in that direction, regardless of who's in the White House. Another important point that we heard was we need to be more serious about our economic security and about the security implication of economic choices. And at the times we were talking about Nord Stream 2, today we're talking about dependency on the PRC, for example. We're working on that by collectively enhancing our resilience. So what I'm trying to say is that our to-do list, our homework list, remains exactly the same regardless of who's in the White House. Spending more, procuring more, strengthening our capabilities, enhancing our forces, building our resilience, getting serious about economic security. All of this does not change for Europeans based on the outcome of the US elections. We have to do it anyways.
So, I mean, you mean that if the Europeans are at least taking their responsibility and spending at least 2% of their GDP on the defense, I mean, Trump will have an interest to keep NATO like that? I mean, he had several times, I mean, said sentences which can make us duped of his willingness to respect the Article 5. No?
I will double down on my point, and my point is that if I look at the strategic environment today, I see that we need to think about deterrence and defense across two theaters, the Euro-Atlantic and the Indo-Pacific. That requires a fundamental rethink from Europeans about what we do, capabilities, forces, and power projection. That is not linked to the outcome of the US elections. That is a much broader strategic trend. So I'm not dismissing your concerns. What I'm saying is that sitting where I sit, my to-do list, my homework, what I need to do as a European ally of NATO and sitting in Brussels remains very much the same, and it is investing more in defense, building and strengthening the transatlantic defense industrial base with a strong European component, building the European pillar of NATO so that we take more of those responsibilities. What will the outcome of that be? In my opinion, it will reassure and reinforce the transatlantic bond. But it would also require us to work more on issues related to resilience, strategic dependency, and economic security. So it's a whole bundle. That said, I do not predict the future.
I want to have your advice of you three on that question.
Yeah.
I mean, will presidency, Kamala Harris, will be different of a Trump presidency if you talk about NATO future? Radoslaw.
Yes, we do wonder a lot about the outcome of the US elections, but I always underline that we in Europe, contrary to the Americans, we do not have the luxury of deciding who's gonna sit in the White House. So, as the saying goes, we should hope for the best and prepare for the worst. And in that case, this means that this should be an incentive for other NATO members, because again, we are talking about NATO, but we are also talking about NATO member countries, which are aligned but not always the same, because it's the national governments that make those decisions about spending, about military purchase, and so on and so on. It should be an incentive for non-American NATO members to invest more in security, to get more engaged, and paradoxically, it will be Trump's wish coming true, because what he's saying basically, if you forget the campaign rhetorics that sometimes he's talking to the very certain part of American voters, if you tumble it dry, that's what the message, that European NATO member countries should do more. And maybe we actually should, and then both sides would be satisfied.
Yes, but look, we are in September. The election is. I'll give you the floor. We are in September. The American election is in 2 months. There's no point. The Europeans are going suddenly to wake up and to push their defense budget at 3 or at 2 or 3%, all of them. So my question concretely is, what if Trump comes back in November? What are his possibilities of, weakening NATO. I mean, he cannot get out like that, can he?
No.
I mean, he's not. Okay, what can he do concretely? What should we be afraid of?
Yeah.
Or not, maybe, but I want you two to respond.
Okay, well,
Yeah, you start.
okay. So what should we be afraid of?
Yeah.
I mean, it's partly what Trump might do, but especially it's what Trump might say. I mean, forgive my saying this, but in a way, NATO is a confidence trick. Article 5 doesn't say what most people think Article 5 says. It says that we will help with the aid that we deem necessary. It doesn't say, as the European Union's solidarity article says, that we will help with all the means available to us.
Yep.
Now, as long as the American president stands firmly behind Article 5, everybody believes in the contrary.
Yep.
Yeah.
We all believe that America will deem it necessary to bring all its power to bear if a NATO ally is attacked. When Trump says, you know, I told this European leader that I would say to Putin, he should do what the hell he likes with countries that are spending less than 2%, that totally undercuts this belief. And my worry is not only does it undercut it in European member states of NATO, but it undercuts it for our potential adversaries. And that's the danger, it seems to me, is that Putin hears what Trump says, and he takes it seriously as well as literally. And that's, you know, it seems to me that that is a great danger. I have a second thing that I worry about, which is more, I mean, in a sense, there's absolutely nothing one can do about it. And that is, if I were an actuary, I would look at Donald Trump, 78 years old, morbidly obese, terrible diet. I would think his life expectancy is not that great.
Oh my God.
It's all about the political will.
The Biden story is just over, but here we have the new one.
Well, I mean, you know, we keep forgetting that, we were all worried about how old Biden was. If Trump were to be elected in November, he would be older than Biden was when he took office in 2021. And that would imply that you might easily get, before the end of this term, a President J.D. Vance. And Vance is an avowed isolationist who has dismissed Europe, dismissed Ukraine. You know, it's not where he is interested. And
So he could quit NATO like that or not?
So there are Americans in the audience.
Yeah, but I mean...
My understanding is you require the Senate to ratify a treaty. You don't require the Senate to withdraw from a treaty.
Not for NATO. Not for NATO, there is a law, but I'm not going to go into U.S. domestic politics. I'll let our American friends do it in the U.S. domestic politics panel later on.
Sorry.
Yeah.
To you.
Yeah.
So what should we be afraid of for the NATO future regarding the American elections?
No,
For
I agree what they're saying. With Trump back in the White House, we are losing 5 years. 5 years of support to Ukraine as a membership, 5 years of losing support to Ukraine, and a strength in Putin. You can always read what political leaders are saying. And that is exactly what Trump is saying. That is exactly what his vice president candidate is saying. And if they are in the White House, I think we will have a different arena. That's why I think you are so right. We have to strengthen the European forces into NATO. But GDP, we are paying 2.1. We are going up to 2.5. We are going up to 3%. That is probably the maximum. So we are not that, aligned with what's happening in the White House.
And on the opposite, what will be a NATO with Kamala Harris? This is my last question with linked to American politics, but I have to ask them. It's very important. To you, Jonas.
I mean, I think
whom
we'd
is
get,
the question directed?
we'd get a lot of continuity. But any American president is also going to have to deal with crises that arise in other parts of the world. And I think, you know, I agree with you.
Yeah.
You know, we have to spend more.
Yeah.
I mean, the UK is talking about spending 2.5% as at the moment as a maximum, which I think is going to turn out to be quite inadequate. So, you know, I think we have to assume that whoever is the American president, they will have to deal with crises that are not in Europe, and that America's resources are also not infinite.
So, transition. Benedetta, what about China? Should NATO have a regional role or a more global role? And what is the perspective towards China?
Great. Well, NATO's mandate and mission is very clear, and it is to ensure the security and defense of its member states, which are European and North American. So in that sense, there is a regional mandate. But we live in 2024, and the world is global interconnected. So the notion that you can ensure the security and defense of the Euro-Atlantic area in a vacuum without taking into consideration what happens in other regions is simply not, doesn't hold up to scrutiny. So in that context, NATO has been looking very much at the China challenge. This was agreed in the 2022 strategic concept, which essentially says China's coercive policies, declared ambitions on the world stage do represent a systemic challenge to NATO. And this is why not only do we have to understand the impact of China's coercive policies on Euro-Atlantic security, but we also have to forge a transatlantic convergence when it comes to responding to this challenge. And that goes through building resilience collectively and nationally, thinking about mitigating and our strategic vulnerabilities and dependencies, which we know is a key area of vulnerability. It is also about strengthening cyber defenses and developing a much stronger response options against hybrid tactics, which we know the PRC very much engages on. And more than that, we're also more and more cognizant of that interconnections between theaters. And this is something that we see with the Ukraine war. European allies and North American allies support Ukraine, but also our Indo-Pacific partners do. Australia, Japan, Korea, New Zealand, they also support Ukraine because they understand that if Ukraine does not prevail as a sovereign independent country, that will send a very disturbing and destabilizing signal to other authoritarian competitors, including those in Beijing. And vice versa, for us as NATO, we understand that a big security crisis or destabilization in the Indo-Pacific, which is the epicenter of world commerce, trade, and development, any destabilization there will impact our security. So we're working on understanding those interlinkages, and in that context, building our cooperation with countries in that region. Last point, this doesn't mean NATO is changing its mandate or operating militarily in the Indo-Pacific, but it does mean that when it comes to threats like cyber threats, hybrid threats that are not bound by geography, it makes sense to work with like-minded countries that, yes, are geographically very far, but geopolitically they're very close. And so that's a little bit what we're doing in a nutshell.
Okay, Radoslaw, do you think China could be a concurrent of Ukraine within NATO?
Yeah. This is something that we are worrying that the attention of the biggest NATO ally will be drawn somewhere else. But I like what Benedetta said about interconnectivity. This is crucial because let me explain. And it's impossible. We have to start with, even though the panel is about future of NATO, we have to go a bit back in time because it's impossible to discuss NATO and security here in Georgia without quoting the words that were said 16 years ago, a few hundred meters away from where we sit, by Polish President Lech Kaczyński. When Georgia was under attack by Russian forces, he said, "Today's Georgia tomorrow Ukraine, then the Baltic states, and someday it's my country, Poland. And unfortunately, we are seeing that he was right. So the fact, the bare fact is that here in Europe, Russia is the #1 threat. And we have to take it into consideration, and all the other allies have to take it into consideration. But this is something that we've been telling our American friends for quite a long time already. If at some point you would need more European involvement on the Indo-Pacific theater, if you want our support in other parts of the globe, because let's not fool ourselves, NATO is becoming a global alliance. The fact that Australia and Japan were present, both in Vilnius and Washington, is a proof of that. If you want our involvement, we collectively, we have to make sure that we have peace and security in our own backyard, meaning Russia. And then there's another argument. And here we come to the interconnectivity, because it's not only on our side. Look what's happening in Ukraine. The drones that are falling on Kiev are Iranian-made. The missiles that are being fired on Ukrainian cities are North Korean. Some of the soldiers fighting against Ukraine are from Cuba. We can see the axis of evil that we've been seeing a long time before is there again, and it's not just Russia versus other parts of the world. It's Russia and all the other evildoers from all over the world working together, which should also give us a perspective that as NATO, we shouldn't divide our attention because we are actually living in a global village.
Jonas, you wanted to add something.
When Putin launched his full-scale attack to Ukraine, we realized this is not a regional war. This is a global war. But we saw the increased tension between China and Russia all the time. So what we need to do, NATO members, is to strengthen our contacts with our Asian partners.
So, Jan, do you think there can be a point in some years where you can see a NATO intervention in Asia?
I mean, it seems quite unlikely to me, for the reasons that Benedetta said. That would certainly be outside the treaty. But that's not to say that the NATO allies don't share common interests in that region. It doesn't have to have a NATO label on it any more than the involvement of Australia and others in the Afghanistan operation had to, presuppose that Australia had become part of NATO. So, I think there are all sorts of ways in which Europe could become involved. But I do think this question about dependencies and so on is critical. And I think we're still acting in a slightly naive way. Now, this is where actually the EU and NATO are working together more and more, one of the areas. And the EU has an economic security strategy. But for countries, and let's name names, like Germany, which are heavily dependent on China as both a market and a manufacturing base, it's quite unpleasant to be told that you need to reduce your dependency, you need to be more careful about what intellectual property you transfer, and so on. And I think, we all felt uncomfortable that the Trump administration put a lot of pressure on the Europeans to try to reduce their ties with China. But as we look at China's behavior, as we look at China's support for Russia's war effort, we sort of have to accept that the triangle that the EU has relied on for a number of years, where we say China can be a partner in some areas, a competitor in some areas, and a systemic rival in others, is coming to a point where actually systemic rival is very large and partner is very small indeed. And so I think, yeah, we have to start taking the fact that China is not necessarily our friend much more seriously.
I know that in NATO we don't like to speak of the internal problems, but Turkish is and has been a problem in NATO. How do you cope with it today?
Yes, so the question bears, this is not a question, to start, NATO is, as you know very well, it's not a supranational organization, it's a multilateral one. So each and every member state remains sovereign and all decisions are taken by consensus. Obviously, this means that when there are questions on the table where the individual member states' national security priorities don't fully align, there is very intense and vibrant discussions. That's not surprising, that's not exceptional, that's essentially 75 years of history of NATO in a nutshell. So the name of the country in question changes, but the question remains, and for the past 75 years we always get the question, but how do you deal with X on Y? And the answer we give is always the same. We try to be greater than the sum of all of our parts through our decision-making process and by fostering consensus. Does that mean that there are not difficult conversations or issues where there are real clashes within member states? Absolutely, that happens all the time. As of today, and if I look at if I look at what we were able to decide in Washington, which was incredibly important on deterrence and defense, on Ukraine, on Indo-Pacific, I think we were able to bridge those gaps and get to a decision that was strong and confident. And we haven't talked about decisions on Ukraine, I'm sure we'll get there. So to answer your question, through a lot of negotiations and by doing the only thing possible within NATO, which is getting consensus, because that's how we're built.
I have a special question for you, Radoslaw. I mean, Poland has pushed its defense budget until 4.2 or
4.2, and the plans for the upcoming year are even more ambitious, 4.7.
Okay, so tell me, I mean, how you did that and how it went with the population. I mean, was it easy? Is it difficult? I mean, in terms of you have to choose between different choices.
Well, from our perspective, and it was actually said many times during the, I wouldn't even say debate, because there was a consensus. So this answers your question, but I will go a bit deeper into that. But the prevailing feeling in Poland when it comes to our security guarantees and security spending is, to put it very, very simply, it's better to be a bit more indebted than being occupied. And that's the reality that we are actually facing after Bucha, after what we've seen in Ukraine. This is the real thing. So getting the consensus that we should increase military spending was easy, even within the very polarized Polish political class. This was something that everyone agreed on. I was a member of the subcommittee that was working on the new bill regarding the Polish army as well as financing of it, and it was. I would wish that all politicians would always work in such a reasonable, meritoric way, hand to hand, as we did on this bill. The same comes for Polish society. The overwhelming majority understands the threats we are dealing with and understands the need to catch up when it comes to our security. How we do this? Well, we do not only use budgetary means. We have created a dedicated fund, a fund that is dedicated to the modernization of Polish army, which can be financed from bonds, from donations. So we are trying to use all the modern economic measures that let actually borrow money on good terms on the global market. Of course, this is a process that will last for decades. So it's not like we have to pay off now, which makes it much easier. But the core thing, the core point is you have to be sure that it's something that you do. You can finance different investments with debt. This is one of the investments that we actually need to focus on.
Okay, it's time now for the questions in the audience. The first lady in pink.
This time the question is about NATO at the NATO panel. So one of the measures of whether a given country is ready to join NATO in the past, historically, has been public opinion about NATO membership. Yep. Georgians are very proud on that issue because while President Shevardnadze declared that Georgia's path is NATO membership in 2002, Georgia's public opinion at the time was at 72-73%, now at 86% favorability. And if you look at the population under 35 years of age, that is at 93%. 93% of Georgian adults under 35 want to see Georgia in NATO. Georgia was the second largest contributor of NATO troops during important missions in Afghanistan and Iraq. And another unique thing about Georgia is that Georgian troops served under direct US command during those missions, which makes those veterans extremely proud. So what is NATO? Central office, as well, and just the leadership. I know it is consensus-based. Given today's political context, what can NATO do for Georgia? And can we, one simple recommendation is, can we always talk about Georgia when we talk about Ukraine in NATO? Because in the past, the bandwagoning, working together, is what made NATO enlargement 1 and 2 successful. Can we do it now for Ukraine and Georgia? Is there readiness for that?
Okay, so Benedetta, you're going to do.
Sure. Well, I think that's a great question, and I want to say, well, that's what you just out loud are the reasons why for NATO the partnership, both political engagement and practical cooperation with Georgia remains incredibly important, and that's why we have an office here, and that's why we have years, decades of outstanding cooperation on security sector reforms, on strengthening cybersecurity, on hybrid threats, on strategic communication, just to mention a few. Looking into the future, I strongly believe it remains a core interest of NATO to maintain and strengthen our partnership and to support the Georgian people's and the Georgians' aspirations towards membership. Of course, how fast you go on that road, it takes two to tango. So if there are domestic developments that you all know that take us 2 steps backwards in terms of the road towards membership, that's the reality where we're in. But from where we are, we remain committed to Georgia's territorial integrity and sovereignty, remain committed to support reforms on the path to membership, and redouble down on Georgia's practical cooperations and dialogue. And that is also, that's because it's the right thing to do, but it's also a recognition that we know very well that the Black Sea region, the Southern Caucasus region are of key strategic importance to European security, and security, peace and prosperity here is an essential component of the broader European security, landscape that is indeed stable and secure. So the case for engagement with Georgia couldn't be clearer. The pace and the momentum, that's where it takes 2 to tango, I will say.
The second question is Nicolas Tenzer.
Just, very, very shortly. The first thing is, basically, NATO has never appeared as strong as it is right now. because there is an appetite for NATO. You have 2 member states joining NATO. We know that NATO is not brain dead, certainly. But on the other hand, unfortunately, NATO appears to be also a very weak organization. Basically, if we consider the Vilnius summit, Washington summit, basically NATO, let's say, has failed Ukraine. I mean, when I mention NATO, it's not NATO, but of course the key member states of NATO. It's not the organization as such. Let's be very clear on that as well. So basically, I think my question is, what's the credibility of NATO as organization if it doesn't allow basically the member states to take action in Ukraine? Because the threat to Ukraine is Ukraine to all NATO member states. The second thing is, what if NATO is not allowed to strike in depth the Russian territory? What's the credibility of NATO deterrence, let's say vis-à-vis Estonia or Poland or other states, if you don't have, I mean, the willingness to take action in Ukraine?
Excellent question. To whom do you, Nicolas? To whom? Who want to
I think
answer?
could be all the panelists, could be Berta, could be Jan, could be others. I mean, thank you.
If you say like that, nobody's going. Okay.
Yeah. So I'll stick my neck
Speak out.
Yeah. So I think you make a very good point. And I accept all that Benedetta said at the beginning about the achievements of the Washington summit. But I think there is a danger that we congratulate ourselves on what we have been able to agree on without looking very closely at what the outcomes are. And when it comes to Ukraine, you know, the outcomes are much better than nothing, but they are much less than is required to win the war. I'm not sure that it's fair to say that NATO stops member states doing certain things, but I think many member states are prepared to use NATO as an alibi to say, well, you know, we can't get consensus on doing this, so we won't do it. Rather than saying, this is something that needs to be done, and if 1 or 2 member states don't wish to join it, we should do this as a coalition of the willing. So yeah, I mean, I think there is definitely an issue there. And I think one thing I feel very strongly about, and I know it was raised on one of the earlier panels, is if the UK, France, and the US were able to put aircraft in the air and to shoot down Iranian drones heading for Israel, they should be able to do the same for Ukraine, particularly when it's basically the same drones.
Huh.
Exactly.
Excellent. Radoslaw?
I will add one thing, because I subscribe to everything you said. There is a credibility problem, and all NATO members should be thinking much more forward, and it requires courage. But I will tell one thing which may be an inspiration to some of the NATO members of out-of-the-box thinking. In the beginning of war, Ukraine was requesting any aircraft that was available to them, including Polish old USSR-made MiG jets. And our initial offer was we can donate the jets to NATO, we can transport them to Ramstein base, and then NATO can donate them to Ukraine. But there was no consensus, as you said, there was no decision on the side of NATO to do so. So a few months later, most of the Polish MiGs mysteriously appeared in the forest bordering with Ukraine. They were dismantled, and then overnight, even more in a more mysterious way, they disappeared. And we have no idea what happened with them, but we hope they are living a happy and good life somewhere else.
Can I
May I
make a
say one
Yes,
thing?
go on.
Yeah. Just one thing about
Quickly.
Ukraine and the Washington summit. Two good things came out, I think. First of all, I think Bill Taylor and I had a conversation. Invite Ukraine to every single NAC meeting. Build bridges until they become members. And then, of course, we got this VII NATO command to supporting Ukraine. I don't know what this is in about, but anyway, two positive things.
Benedetta,
Just
very quickly.
Yeah,
and then
it's
we
gonna
have-
be. I'm gonna be very telegraphic because a lot has been said, but I wanted to just pick up on one particular point. The Secretary General of NATO, and I think it's probably worth repeating, has been very clear and on the record to say that while it is of course a member state sovereign decision how to support Ukraine in terms of military equipment and what caveats to impose, he strongly believes that Ukraine should be allowed to defend itself in line with international law, and that means striking back into Russia. So just to put that on the record, that is our position as NATO through our leadership.
Here.
Thank you.
And
Can I?
Yes, you
Yes,
can.
thank
Just tell who you are.
My name is Georgi Kandelaki. I work with a think tank called SOLA, but in my previous life, I used to be chair and then also member of the Georgian delegation to NATO Parliamentary Assembly. And I will also try, like one of the preceding questions, to somehow link up this discussion with Georgia, because we are in Georgia, and my question would be to Mr. Bond, but also those members of the panel who sort of wear political hats, if you will, because my question is political. Now, we are in 2024, and Georgia is on the verge of Russian victory. I have argued in the past that Georgia relinquished de facto the aspiration to become member of NATO, the political question, years ago, while maintaining proper talking points, but talking points and policy are not the same, and the failure to recognize that was an enabler for the growth of Russian influence. I have seen too many bureaucrats, good people, who developed entrenched pro-status quo agendas, aggressively dismissing crossing of one red line in the context of Russian influence in Georgia after another. So it may be too late, but is it not time to have a serious discussion on how we got here, how Georgia has morphed into a Russian satellite? Thank you.
Quick answer, Jan. We still have 3 minutes, so it's going to be okay.
Okay, quick answer. Notwithstanding all the problems that there are, I don't think a country where, as we heard, 90% plus of the population supports NATO, of the young population, 80% plus of the overall population supports NATO membership and EU membership, is a Russian satellite yet. And I hope after the 26th of October that you will have a government that more closely reflects the population's views on their international alignment.
Okay, last question.
Thank you very much. I'm also not satisfied with the outcome of the Washington summit concerning the support for Ukraine. But I have a feeling, that what is crucial for the credibility of the alliance, these are those anchors that were created to make Article 5 inevitable in the situation of the threat for Euro-Atlantic security. And the questions are, if NATO is ready to implement the defense regional plans in a right way, this is the first fundamental question. The second one is about the new model of NATO response forces, if they exist or not, and what is the perspective for them. And the third one, it is the set of exercises that would implement those plans together with those forces for the benefit of NATO security. I know that there is a kind of paradox that we cannot discuss details of those three fundamental issues so broadly and openly, but they determine, in fact, actually, credibility of the alliance.
I agree.
I'd like to know your reaction, especially Jan Bond's reaction concerning that.
Actually,
Have you actually
I'd
seen the plan? I'm
I'd be
like, I
much-
actually have
no,
seen
I
them,
haven't-
but yes,
I haven't
let him
seen the
comment.
plans, so much better to ask somebody who probably knows what's in them.
What do I know? Well, that's without giving, of course, without going into the details, of course, that's our key area of work. It is about ensuring forces, capabilities, enablers, logistics, exercise plans to ensure the full executability of the regional defense plans. We are, on many aspects, we are actually farther along than what we thought we would be, including on the force structure, where we now have 500,000 troops under high readiness levels, and we were at the beginning, we were aiming for 300,000. So there are indicators where we're outperforming our initial assessments. There are others where we have catch-up work to do, and I expect going towards the next summit, you will hear more, for example, on integrated air and missile defense, which is an area where we really need to accelerate the adaptation. So overall, yes, we are the full executability of our regional defense plan is front and center what we're working on day in and day out. We are in a good place. There's a lot more to do in the years to come. That's the shortest I can do without pulling out the map. And
Well, I'm afraid it will be the final word. Thank you very much to everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for moderating.
Thank you very much, Isabelle. Thank you.